Okay, I wanted to finish up on the New England Village part. So last time I sort of came to a screeching halt talking about this whole idea of linearity and also this idea of taming the wild. In the Calvinist Puritan view of the world, this I think was pretty typical of most Protestant factions. Nature was seen as the work of the devil. Now, as I've mentioned last time or some times ago, to the Calvinists very specifically, when you were born, you were actually the child of the devil. So kids were the devil's kids, and so they were always getting into trouble. They were always da 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 da. And this becomes a huge part of sort of the American image. If you think of like Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer, all this type of stuff, bad kids and kids were bad. This becomes a huge part of the American educational system under the Calvinists because this is why they were so big on, recesses and bells and, going to school, being at school at the same time and never being late. This was the idea of drilling in discipline, which meant that you would get closer to God because the devil was fond of anarchy. And therefore, the wild of nature, because it wasn't human controlled, was also not really strange enough when you think about it, since all this was, of course, built by God. Maybe as a test, I don't know. But anyways, this idea of nature was antithetical to the idea of discipline, order, and sort of civilization growth, learning, the whole 9 yards. So the Calvinists were violently opposed to nature. So, for example, if you set up a village or town, as we'll see in a second, in Williamsburg, you take out all the nature and you replace it with a park. In fact, if you think about it, Kapiolani Park is a perfect example if you're familiar with it. That's a classic Calvinist green space. And it says something that you call them green spaces, you don't call them natural because they sure as hell aren't. The slopes of Diamond Head, though it's exotic vegetation, would actually be a closer example of natural. So the whole idea of domesticating, taming, controlling nature, which is so much a part of the American way of looking at stuff, was absolutely central to the Calvinists. Their idea is what you were doing is you're bringing civilization and the template of God, if you would, on the blank slate of nature. And so everything that you did had to reflect this. And that included when you built a town and when you built a house, you didn't want anything there to look natural because that would imply that you were lazy, sloppy, and somehow, in league with the devil in some way, shape, or form, although at least probably usually through just being lazy. The other part of this also, and this was a big thing in the sort of Protestant movements of the period, was the idea of God as a mechanic. There was a huge fascination in the 15 through 1700s about the idea of the universe being like a giant clock or a giant mechanical instrument. And God built it that way. And so one of the things you could do theologically, though I don't know if the Calvinists were really into this too much, was actually then figure out the structure of the organization, or if you would, how all the parts worked that made up the world. And therefore you would be, to a certain extent, looking at God. This is still a part of a lot of the science disciplines, especially, say, astronomy in some way, shape, or form. There's always sort of this underlying component that if you understand this stuff, you're understanding the deepest parts of the universe, which actually goes back to a theological idea that God, was meticulous down to the level of, particles. And therefore, what you're doing is you're actually sort of looking at God's handiwork directly. I don't know how to really phrase it properly. That's the best I can think of. This was a huge part of art and music at the time. Someone like Bach, for example, his partita or fugues were sort of a reflection of this idea of the structure of the universe and the fact that everything could be ordered, structured, and predictable. So this was a huge part of Western thought. And then pretty quickly, of course, this came out, of course, the Catholic Church and the intellectual movements like the Jesuits. And so this, wasn't just a Protestant thing. But this idea of bringing order to chaos. And of course, nature and natural, of course, were chaotic. But this also meant if you went somewhere else, if you moved into the western part of the United States, you're dealing with Native Americans, they were chaotic. If you come over here and deal with Hawaiians in the 1820s, they are chaotic. So it also meant that folks that weren't Christian in the Calvinist version of Christian were also in some way, shape, or form somehow chaotic, natural, and of course linked to the devil. No, in their defense, I suppose, to a certain extent, you could argue that their view of it wasn't so much that people were of the devil, it's that they were ignorant of order and structure. And so if you gave them that through bringing them literacy and free schools, you could draw them from the world of anarchy, if you would, to the world of order and structure. And actually, when you think about this, is still a big part in modern media. The idea of post-apocalyptic worlds, just so beloved of sci-fi and so beloved of video games. The color white. I mentioned a little bit last time. White becomes key for the Puritans because in nature you very rarely see it, and if you do, it never stays white. Think of snow that gets all mushy. So making things white was a great way to manifest this idea that you're going to spend time and effort to keep something white and bring their order and discipline to a world of nature, which would be, dirt colors or plant colors or something like that. And notice how also in this, especially in places like Williamsburg, you then remove all the discordant natural elements, which of course, sadly enough, includes Indians like my relatives. They get dumped out of this. They're not part of this. You also then can edit out the partially natural components, which would be slavery, African Americans, etc. You can bring them in when they become part of the order or structure. But if since they're not seen as being as ordered and as Calvinist as their sort of, Anglo-European counterparts, then you sort of not have them around. Until very recently, Williamsburg really didn't have anything to do with Native Americans or African Americans, though African Americans were probably a majority of the population, and Native Americans, there was a Native American village there until the Calvinists wiped it out. So let's take a real quick look again back at Williamsburg. Okay, we're back in the town. Again, remember, this is all a National Historic Site or National Park. I'm not sure which it is. So all these buildings, I think probably 3 or 4 are original, but all the rest of them are from somewhere else. So when you're looking at Williamsburg, it's always important to remember that it's a early 20th century interpretation of the late 18th century, or if you would, a 1920s interpretation of 1770. So if we look at this, notice again how we have the classic Calvinist image here. Let's just pick these 2 guys since they're pretty good. So what you do is this is a little bit close because I think it looks like a graveled surface. So notice how you've gotten rid of nature. This all would have been largely in forest, this whole area. So you've got rid of the forest. You probably left a couple of the trees that were useful, but in many cases you probably planted new trees, especially say food-bearing trees that you brought in from Europe. So what you've also got here is you've got the idea of white. So you paint your house white. This one's not showing it because of the dark, but you paint the houses white. As I mentioned last time, one of the classic examples of the Calvinist Puritans is the white picket fence. In Europe, you don't tend to see white fences. You see fences, though oftentimes they're of stone because, of course, they've oftentimes been there for hundreds of years. But again, you have to remember, this is not entirely migratory. This is a very transitory world when you look at someplace like Williamsburg. So here we see the same thing. There's also a whole mess of aspects that when you look at this, and we'll flash into it in a second, that are actually typical and functional in this period that become part of the symbolic package or repertoire when Americans in our time refer back to the past. So again, think of that prefab home we like to know. I'll show you another example in a sec. So here we have the reality, sort of, but the houses are accurate. I mean, this is what people lived in. The reality of late colonial, early independent U.S. state in North America. So if you would, the largely British North Americans having settled and taken over this part of North America from their Native American counterparts. And then this is the world they build. It's a world of order. It's a world of structure. It's a world of straight streets, and everything's linear. The houses are all parallel to each other. This is bringing order to chaos, and that's the way that the Calvinists saw themselves, and that's the way they saw their place in the world, was to bring order out of chaos. Very quickly, let me see if I can find a park here. Okay, here we go. So here's the Calvinist view of nature. I have no idea what this building is, but it's obviously some sort of substantial important building. So here's what you do with nature. You rip out the forest. You get rid of all the native plants and animals, and you bring in grass. This is a peculiarly American thing. Americans are absolutely fascinated with grass. We spend an enormous amount of time, money, and effort on it. It's one of the major reasons for the water shortages in the American West. It's sort of mind-blowing when you look at the American fascination with grass, which is not a European thing. You see a little bit of it in Europe, but usually if you see stuff like this would be a soccer pitch or, or rugby or whatever sport, or pétanque, for example. It serves a functional purpose. The idea of grass in this form is peculiarly Calvinist, peculiarly American. And so again, notice what you've done is you've completely disciplined and civilized nature to the extent that now you run linear paths and gravel through the green. So you've made it very clear that you can beat nature. Now, of course, this is incredibly difficult to do. You have to mow it all the time, or back, and you have to remember, till 70 years ago, you clipped the suckers by hand with scissors. You have to constantly keep it around. Grass is not a natural commodity anywhere, certainly in North America. This would turn back into pasture grasses, and then you'd get weeds showing up, and pretty much it'd be, short forest probably. And if they abandoned this within 5 years, you'd have no idea there was probably ever a park here. So this takes an enormous amount of effort, enormous amount of labor, enormous amount of cost to keep it looking like this. And again, if you think about it, the Calvinists are just totally stoked because this is the way the world should be. It should be expensive. It should be hard, because what you're showing is you're more powerful, you're more focused, and you've got a clearer agenda than nature, which again is chaos. So they're constantly beating against the forces of chaos to make the world a disciplined, structured place. If you look at everything about this structure, it just screams order. And that's Williamsburg, and that's why Williamsburg is a really good reflection in part of the world of the late 1700s, though it wasn't near as ordered as I like to spin it now. As we'll see later, and I think one of the Townsend episodes and have you look at in terms of kitchens, but certainly in what you might call the 20th, 21st centuries interpretation of this view. And this is why this becomes so critical, because this is the way Americans see their world. This is the first of what Meining would call, or J.B. Jackson would call, these landscapes, of course, as Jackson does in his westward moving house. This is the world this is the colonial world. This is the world of settlement. This is the world of taking raw land, in the sense of raw natural land, and converting it to a usable, functional, civilized landscape suitable for real good / Euro Americans to settle and basically take over. So let's see how this is played out in the modern context. Okay, so what I've done is I randomly picked a town. I picked Marshalltown, Ohio. I don't remember why, but there was some sort of family history with the place. And so let's go down to a street in Marshalltown. And again, this is entirely random. I did mark it just before I did this, so I wanted to flow more easily. But let's take a look what this place looks at. Let's see how much of Williamsburg we see here. I'm sorry about that. So we're now, I don't know, what, 1,500 miles to the west. We're in Iowa. And so this would be, these aren't really old homes. They look like they're second half of the 20th century, somewhere pretty recent, but I'd say probably 60s through 80s, since they look to be in good shape, but it's not an older part of town. And again, I just randomly picked Iowa, I randomly picked Marshalltown, I randomly picked this. And I should point out, I found this on the first shot hitting a street. So let's take a look at what of this is actually what you might call a modern referent, using the bits and pieces, think of like a Lego set, that would make up what we think of as the colonial New England world. So if we look around here, we got straight streets, we got discipline, we've got lawns. Oh, someone's being modern. And looky at that, we've even got a white picket fence. So what we've got here is we've got a modern version. Down one house here. We've got a modern interpretation of Williamsburg. Oh, this house is perfect. So what we've got here is it's landscaped. You've brought order out of chaos. You have no way of knowing. In fact, I have no way of knowing what this place used to look like before people settled in and put a place down here. My suggestion would be, if this part of Iowa probably would have been prairie grass prairie. So, you would have seen antelope and stuff like that wander around here. And occasionally, probably one of my relatives cruising through here, since Arapaho and Cheyenne did sort of, hang around here. So what you've got here in the modern context, the house is white. You've got the white picket fence. You've got structured, very structured, straight, and just huge amounts of linearity on both sides here. You've even got a boundary to separate the lawn from the bushes or whatever, shrubbery, whatever we call it. You've also got, and it's a key part to remember this, is a whole mess of aspects within the structure of the home that reflect the modern interpretation of New England. The idea that you mark off personal property. So you've got this fence here. The purpose of this fence isn't to keep anything out. There's even a gate there, but you're demarcating personal property from what you might call the public, or if you want to go back to our Japanese stuff, or say digital, this would be someone's personal space in the sense of personal, and this would be the idea of external space. And here, if you notice in the back here, you've got a back area to actually demarcate the back space from the fronter space. You've also got a lot of technical aspects that are very peculiar to colonial architecture. Now, in Williamsburg, most of these were functional. The fences weren't. The function of the fence was just like it is now. It was just basically to make a statement. Yeah, though, if I showed you last time what we call split rail fences were actually functional because even cattle can't get through a split rail fence. So you had functional fences in Williamsburg. God knows you needed them. But in the residential areas, what you would have is you'd have these because these were statements that you were a good, upstanding member, not only of the Calvinist Puritan community, but you bought into the value system, and this was part of your display. The fact that you'd have, cut grass, which you have to remember at the time was cut grass. It wasn't lawn in the modern sense. Even the plants here, these things don't grow this way. Everything here has been trimmed, and again, very mechanical, very geometric forms that are totally unnatural. And that's, again, showing the dominance of people over nature. So again, this is all borrowed from the modern ethos of Williamsburg, the modern, Lego box. One of the quintessential ones would be the shutters. In Williamsburg, shutters were a necessity. Glass was incredibly expensive. In modern terms, a pane of glass for a window would be anywhere from $500 to $1,000 a pane. And these are small, sort of like paper-sized pieces, which is why you always see the small glasses like I'm showing here in the garage. That's why older windows were small, because you could only pour glass in small pieces. That was very opaque. It was very distorted, so it'd be like funny glass today. It's really weird if you look through colonial glass. It's distorted. You can get a very surreal view of the outside world, and to a certain extent, almost no one can actually see inside. But it was basic purpose to bring light. But it was also because it was expensive. If you had windows, you were middle upper class in the 1700s. Most folks just went away with oilcloth. You just had cloth that had been oiled to make it sort of wind weatherproof. And that's what you had. So what are oftentimes called shades now originally were your window covers, in the sense of open space covers. So the glass that houses had in Williamsburg was yet another statement of aspirational status and prestige. We don't tend to think of them that way now, at least normal windows, but that's what they were. So in this modern context, you have the windows. Now you also have the protective element, which would be the shutters. Since glass was very expensive, and hail or anything else you'd be out thousands of dollars. So you have storm shutters, which were typical everywhere in the world, but were also found obviously in places like Williamsburg. So you go back and look at the Williamsburg images, you'll see shutters, and they're real functional shutters, which means, among other things, you couldn't have the windows this close to each other because the shutters here would have to cover this window, which would actually bring them banging up against that one. So shutters were functional pieces of, excuse me, I guess, house furniture for protecting very valuable pieces of the house, glass windows. In the modern context, you buy these suckers at Home Depot. You liquid nail them or otherwise put them on the wall. They're totally non-functional. They're not hinged. They're entirely decorative elements. But they manifest, again, the New England heritage. So what you do is you take the Williamsburg stuff, almost like we looked at it. You take the different elements of a Williamsburg house and you just take them out of the house. You make them portable. You make them, standalones, and then you can slap them on any other type of structure like the bungalow here, and bam, you've got yourself a modern semi-New England home. So to a certain extent, I can pretty much guarantee the folks that live in this place probably know absolutely nothing about the Calvinist Puritans, but they grew up in the American educational system, or when they moved over, they were inculcated by it. So they become assimilated in the American system, and by being assimilated, You basically take on these trappings of saying, I'm a good, still, which, as in Williamsburg, I'm a good, upstanding member of the group, and here's how I manifest this: the color of the house, the fact that I got this fence, I've got these shutters, even though they're non-functional. I've got these windows, even though, of course, this is actually one window with just literally glued on strips to make them look like smaller windows. And we have tons of that at Chaminade. So, all this stuff, when you think about it, is pretty strange because it's totally not functional. But again, this is, something, again, as I've already mentioned, I'm getting very tired this semester, is perception it drives reality. And so what you're going to find is the folks that are in this neighborhood want to look like the good upstandings of an American community. Oh, this house is perfect. Here you've got the lawn. Here you've got the totally squared off hedge, which again takes a lot of work. Here you've got got fake shutters. And I should point out that shutters would actually be useful, even in a modern context. But again, that would mean the windows would have to be smaller and spaced further apart. So you just don't. The shutters are just decorative elements that serve absolutely no functional purpose. In fact, if you look at it, almost all these places have shutters. Here you've even got this sort of illusion of actual functional shutters, though of course, again, they're not. So what you've got here is, if you would, a 20th or 21st century interpretation of the values and attitudes that are manifested in Williamsburg being brought into our world to say we're a part of that group. Now, some of it gets pretty bizarre to think about it here in Hawaii, I'm sure in much of the mainland. These are very likely not even wood. They're actually plastic, which has the great advantage, as long as it rains every once in a while, the buggers stay white. So you don't have to spend any time doing this. This is one of the weird aspects about borrowing aspects of the past. Then not only are they not functional anymore, but they don't even serve the same sort of moral social purposes they did. Back in Williamsburg, these white picket fences and the ones that are there still take a lot of upkeep because you got to clean them off and paint them every year. And, things like the shutters have to be hinged every year. You have to make sure the hinges work every year, and you have to make sure they still work every year. The glass has to be protected and cleaned every year. In the modern context, these are probably plastic. So if you really get concerned, you can just hose the buggers down in probably a minute, and bam, they're all good as new. So it really doesn't manifest labor. It really doesn't manifest effort. It does manifest your sort of perception, your relationship with the world around you, that you want structure and you want privacy. But it's not really doing. Calvinists would be very bothered by this fence. It would really bug them that someone was cheating, and what it was supposed to do. It wasn't serving that function anymore. In fact, they'd probably go completely off on it. But in the modern context, people would be bothered. Well, why would I work hard, I'm very Calvinist. I don't have the time to mess around with some stupid fence, so I'm just going to make a plastic one that works just as well. So this is the importance of the New England village. The New England village might be from the 1750s, like Williamsburg, but it's still here in the 21st century. We still use large parts of the sort of reference symbols that made up a New England house and a New England community, because to a large extent, the New England community is still our ideal of the perfect community. People knew each other, they talked to each other, they hung around together, they spent time together, they shared common values and attitudes, which you can see just in this community just as well as Williamsburg. And in doing so, they made themselves uniquely American. In contrast, if you remember, I think last time at the very beginning, I showed you a British rural village, in contrast to their English counterparts, which are not laid out this way and don't look like this. This is a peculiarly American landscape. The Williamsburg one, no more, no less than this one is. You might see it in other parts of the world, but now if you see this, in France or something like that, they've actually borrowed this American landscape for reasons that, I haven't had the time to go into in this class.